Welcome to Breaking the News Plus. It was a big day in Minneapolis with news coming out early this morning that the U.S. Department of Justice is looking to dismiss the case that would have brought a consent decree to the Minneapolis Police Department. There's a lot to unpack here and understand. And to help us do that, I've invited University of St. Thomas professor Rachel Moran on our Plus app today. She's with the School of Law at St. Thomas, and she's also the founder of the Criminal and Juvenile Defense Clinic at St. Thomas. Hello, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
So in layman's terms, as we always do for our viewers, the words like consent decree can be a little bit confusing. What does that mean? And take us to what a consent decree is and why, in your opinion, this news today matters.
Sure. A consent decree is kind of a fancy word for a court order. Basically, it's called consent because the two parties, which in this case would have been the city of Minneapolis and the U.S. Department of Justice, are agreeing together to enter into a settlement where the city has to make changes to how it conducts its policing. And a judge would have been overseeing that.
And in Minneapolis, we have kind of two going on at the same time. There's an agreement with the state that looks at the Minneapolis Police Department and its patterns and practices, and that is already in effect. This is the federal side, ordered by the Biden administration for the Department of Justice to oversee our police department. But now, as you know, we have a new president and a new Department of Justice, and they make news today saying they motion to get rid of this idea that they're going to oversee our police department. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's basically right. Right before the President Biden left, the parties had come to an agreement that they would let a judge oversee required changes to the police department. And then when President Trump came in, he put a pause on that. He said, and today he essentially said, no, we don't want a judge involved. We don't want to pursue these changes at all.
In your opinion, is this a big loss? Is this no big deal? What should the average Minnesotan make of this?
I think it's somewhere in between those options. It is a loss for sure. We have a state consent decree already, as you mentioned, that is focused on racial discrimination or bias or disparities in policing. And the Department of Justice one, which is the one we're losing, that would have involved more things. It would have involved requiring the city to change how they interact with people with disabilities. It would have required the police department to change how they engage with First Amendment issues like assemblies or freedom of speech or protests. And so the Department of Justice decree would have covered in some ways more ground than what the state is focused on. And now we don't have that.
And you mentioned, Rachel, those pauses being put into place pretty quickly after President Trump was sworn in for his second term. So to me, seeing this news today, yes, it's news, but it's not completely surprising that they're stepping away.
No, it's actually not at all surprising. President Trump, in his last time in office, did this in Chicago with problems in the Chicago Police Department. He's been very vocal, even during his campaigns, that he is not really enthused about oversight of police. And so it's an unusual thing in the sense that other presidents haven't done this, but it's fairly expected from what we know of him.
And because we have that state consent decree still in place that went in place in July 2023, Hennepin County judge signed off on that decree between the city of Minneapolis and our Minnesota Human Rights Commission. And they said today that's not going anywhere. So that's still in place. You noted there are some differences, but does the state consent decree, will it bring about the change that some said needed to come to the Minneapolis Police Department?
That's definitely the goal. And that's why I say I don't think it's quite a huge loss in the sense that the state is still working with the city on creating some of these changes, particularly the changes that address racial disparities in how policing happens in Minneapolis. And so the State Department of Human Rights is still focused on that. They're already working with a judge and a group called Effective Law Enforcement to make those changes, and that's still happening.
One of the things I heard Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara say over the last 48 hours, because they held a press conference yesterday, probably getting wind that this was coming, saying, here's the changes that we've made so far in the next year, and we have a long way to go. He made a comment just to say, we're still going to make changes, even if the DOJ pulls out. Is that something people can have faith in?
Well, I think to some extent he does want to make changes, and they have made some changes. Uh, but now we have no one to essentially force them, right? And so the question is just, will the police department do this of its own accord? Or if we got to a place where they're not making changes, can anyone else enforce that? And on the issues like the American with Disabilities Act, the free speech issues, we have no one left now to enforce those concerns.
And were those concerns ones that were brought forward by the previous Department of Justice saying, we see that you aren't doing well in these areas, hence the reason we're going to try to oversee you in these areas?
Right. Yes. The Department of Justice investigation, which was 2 years, very detailed, full of evidence, did show problems with the way the police engage with people with disabilities, problems with the way the police department policed protests, for example, and other free speech issues like attempts to record officers. And so they did find a pattern and practice of violations in those areas.
We weren't the only police department that the Department of Justice is taking a pass on in terms of these consent decrees. Most notably, at least to me, was Louisville. That is where Breonna Taylor was killed by police in an ambush. So it's taking its hands off Minneapolis, Louisville, Phoenix, Trenton, Memphis, New York, Oklahoma City, Louisiana, saying basically nationwide, as a Department of Justice, the United States DOJ is not interested in overseeing police departments.
Correct. Yes. And that again is consistent with what the president has said all along. So this is not a bait and switch. It is his position, which is that he does not want to what the Department of Justice perceives as wasting time on enforcing these consent decrees. They don't want to do that. They don't want to be part of oversight of police departments.
In your field of research and study, have you found that consent decrees like this that would have taken place here, are they truly effective in changing a department?
It's actually kind of an open question. There are changes that have been made. There are some quasi success stories. There's reason to be hopeful about them, but they cost a great deal of money, which is something that the city of Minneapolis has complained about. And the changes tend to be very slow. And so it's not absurd to question whether they're effective. I think my concern is when you have nothing in place to enforce changes, then you really do have to rely on the city to make changes of its own accord. But there are totally legitimate financial concerns, especially, and efficiency concerns with these consent decrees.
Would that financial burden fall on the city to pay for the change?
Yes.
That makes sense. This doesn't come at a time that doesn't raise eyebrows. The anniversary of the police murder of George Floyd is in just a matter of days, and this decision comes down today. And I think to the passerby, they think this consent decree from the feds is just to make sure what happened to George Floyd doesn't happen to another person. But it's broader than that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly that's how the investigation started for both the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the Department of Justice. It started with George Floyd's murder and the aftermath and the outcry for change. But they didn't find one isolated incident of one or even four officers behaving poorly. They found at both the state level and in the federal investigation widespread practices of racial disparities in policing, of constitutional violations, of improper use of force, of poor accountability structures. These are not just something that happened to George Floyd.
It happened over a period of how long did the research go back?
several decades in some situations, not in every investigation, but they looked back into decades of problems.
So if you find several decades of problems and now you don't have this DOJ consent decree, how does a city turn the ship?
Well, they've had a few years already to make changes. They certainly have leadership that professes an interest in change, and it doesn't happen easily. I think that's part of the frustration watching it is when you have decades of cultural problems that impact how the police operate, you can't just get rid of 20 officers or find a couple bad apples. You do need extensive culture change, extensive training change, some turnover in who the police are. And so, even though we're 5 years past George Floyd's murder and several years past the results of these investigations, um, I do tell people it takes time. And so, it's hard to know when they've had too much time.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you're speaking about it, I think of something that, and I don't say this lightly, that could take a generation. It could take that long to completely change the culture of a place or an institution, if at all.
Right, I agree. And it's hard because as a society, we have let policing problems fester for so many decades. And I don't mean to say I'm not criticizing every police officer, but there are significant systemic problems with how policing happens. And we've known about that for many decades, but not really done anything significant to fix it. And so now there is some energy around creating change, but impatience, understandable impatience. Yet, like you said, it's a long-term problem that requires a long-term solution.
And it obviously doesn't help get to the root of some of these issues, at least from my view, when the argument is by some, well, if you believe that there should be oversight or consent decrees, you're anti-police. You can be for public safety and for change at the same time, right?
Right. And even a lot of my research and a lot of my work criticizes the police, but ultimately, I want everyone to be safe. And that includes police officers as well as community members. But we need to think critically about how that best happens. And for a lot of decades, we had communities of color saying they're not being treated appropriately, but people in power largely ignoring those voices.
My last question for you, Rachel, is maybe, and this is just a housekeeping question. This is a motion by the Department of Justice. It does have to go to District Judge Magnuson to say, okay. Is that just procedural, or is there any way that the judge says, no, you have to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's almost certainly just procedural. The judge can't really force the Department of Justice to enforce a settlement. And so I think I have every expectation that the judge will simply sign this motion or grant the request to dismiss.
All right. Thank you for your time today, Rachel. I really appreciate it, as always, giving us some clarity about what this does and doesn't mean. We really appreciate you being on Breaking the News Plus tonight.
Sure. Thanks, Jenna.
You bet. And that's Breaking the News Plus for this Wednesday night.